Dear IFAC affiliates, dear colleagues, dear guests, it is a pleasure to have you gathered today for this 2024 IFAC lecture. This lecture is a long-standing tradition of IFAC and is usually chaired by the IFAC secretary, which is myself currently. The lecture is held in person in spring in conjunction to an IFAC executive officers meeting in Austria, where the IFAC secretariat is located. The meeting will indeed take place during the next 2 days here at the TU in Vienna. So many thanks to Andreas Kugi and Christian Ott and their colleagues for arranging the venue and for the lecture and the meetings. Thank you a lot. So today, I have the honor to welcome Professor Richard Braatz for his lecture. Richard Braatz graduated from California Institute of Technology in the USA, where he obtained his PhD degree in 1993. He then held positions at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, was visiting scholar at Harvard University, and is now professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at MIT. Richard's research interests are in applied mathematics and control theory, data analytics and machine learning, biopharmaceutical manufacturing, materials processing, and indeed, when looking at his publications, it's amazing to see how broad his scope is, going from fundamental theoretical results on model predictive control, robust control, optimal control, adaptive control, but also diagnosis, parameter estimation, identification, learning, as well as a huge number of applications in biology, chemistry, manufacturing, and lithium-ion batteries. But you can guess that from the title of today's lecture. These applications are not only illustrations of his excellence in theoretical research, but truly applied results related to cooperations with more than 20 companies, including IBM, United Technologies Corporations, and others. His achievements were recognized by more than 25 honors and awards that I will not list. From an IFAC point of view, I may mention his Automatica paper prize in 2017, as well as his 2 Journal of Process Control paper prize awards in 2008. 2008 was also the year when Richard was elected to be IFAC Fellow. Another form of recognition of his excellence is attested by his editorial involvement, in particular being member of the editorial boards of the IFAC journals Automatica, Annual Reviews in Control, Journal of Process Control, IFAC Papers Online, and some other major automatic control transactions and journals. In addition to these scientific activities and achievements, Richard is dedicated to serve professional societies. He's active in IEEE Control System Society, for example, as editor-in-chief of IEEE Control System magazine and member of the Board of Governors. He is active as well in the American Automatic Control Council, which is the IFAC NMO for USA, where he was, for example, he served as president. Within IFAC, he participates in 9 technical committees and chaired the Technical Committee on Chemical Process Control. He has been involved in many committees, as, for example, the Database Task Force and some others. And currently, he is IFAC Executive Officer and more precisely, Vice President for Conferences. So congratulations, Richard, for all these achievements. You will now share some of your results and thoughts with your talk entitled Machine Learning-Based Lifetime Prediction and Charging Optimization for Lithium-ion Batteries. Please, Richard.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to share some of my results today. So I'll basically first talk about feature engineering for battery lifetime prediction classification. So I'll talk a bit about what that is and why we use this particular type of machine learning approach for prediction. I'll then switch over more into dynamic optimization and control, focusing on Bayesian optimization for a calculation of fast charging protocols for lithium-ion batteries. And then I'll talk a little bit about hybrid modeling, where you mix machine learning and mechanistic modeling. So what is the objective that we are trying to solve, or what we have solved? So one of the interesting things about lithium-ion batteries, so they're sort of everywhere, right? So they're very ubiquitous. But one of the interesting aspects is because of the way they're designed, there's a lot of intrinsic variability. And they try to reduce that variability in manufacturing, but it's always there. And you can't really get rid of it due to the specific length scales associated with batteries. And this variability increases over time, even if you take a battery one after the other on an assembly line. Its variability gets larger and larger. And so here was an example. I'll show some more data later. But even under the most optimistic conditions for these batteries, you can see the dark gray where you have, some variability, plus or minus 1% in capacity. But over time, the battery ages and it gets wider and wider. And this was a study that's done a few years ago under extremely optimistic conditions, where all the batteries were under exactly the same conditions. You can still see this spread. And the reason that's important is that affects applications, especially automotive type applications where you have lots of batteries. You need them behaving sort of somewhat in sync together. You get very poor, efficiencies. Now, we've recently did some analysis of field data from a major company where 50% of the battery packs that failed was due to one bad battery. Okay, so it's very extreme, the effects of just one battery can take down your whole battery pack. And so the problem that I'll be talking about today was actually given to us by Toyota. And this work I'll be talking about is funded by Toyota Research Institute. And so they gave us a series of problems to solve that would help them bring in new battery chemistries and new battery materials more quickly and develop basically battery charging protocols more quickly. So, and the first part I'll talk about here is can we very quickly predict a battery lifetime? And the lifetime here is also called cycle life or remaining useful life, but it's how many times can I charge and discharge a battery before the battery goes kaput, okay? And we'll here define it as 80% of initial capacity. Everything I present here, you can define differently. It won't really matter. It'll be very similar kind of results. Now you say, why do you want to do it very early? Well, the reason you want to do it early is that for an application like automotives, you want to mean a battery lifetime of about 8 years to be really functional. And then those batteries some will even go to 16 years, some will go a little bit lower, but you want to mostly around eight years to be sort of a reasonable trade-off. But you don't, when you have a new battery chemistry, you don't want to do a test and then wait 8 to 16 years for like checking a protocol and then do it again and do it again. That takes centuries, right? It takes centuries to convert. So you come up with ways of trying to accelerate the process so that you can make changes to the battery as well as making changes to the protocol without having to take decades to get a new chemistry or new material really to market. So that's why they wanted us to do this very fast prediction. And in particular, you'd like to be able to cycle a battery very, very short and then make your decision on that and then go to, let's say, another protocol or a new or maybe modified battery chemistry. So you like to be able to do it very fast. So the first question is, can we take very short cycling data, predict what will happen years later? And so that's what we'll talk about first. And you can interpret my entire talk in terms of the diagram on the lower right. So it's basically a closed loop optimization kind of process. So you're going to have cyclers, which are shown on the left, and allow you to cycle maybe 50 to 100, quite a large number of batteries all in parallel. And you're going to take measurements. You're going to measure current, you're going to measure temperature, voltage. And then the idea is that data then gets pushed over to this early predictor, so you don't have to run it for 8 to 16 years. You can do it more quickly, hopefully, if you've got the right kind of prediction algorithm. And then those predictions and variability information, so not just your, the accuracy of your predictions, go to an optimal experimental design where you're going to design all of your changes for all those batteries at once, and you're going to send that to the cycler again. And you like to have the entire cycle rotations or iterations occur in like 3, like pretty fast. You don't want to be iterating, tens of cycles for running this thing. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so I'm going to focus purely on the early prediction in the upper right first. Now, I mentioned we're going to do some more data. These are all data that's collected with my collaborators. The battery cycle was at Stanford at the time. These are the standard cells used for automotive. They're cycle A123 M1A cells. They were all cycled till they lost 80% of the original nominal charge. And so SOH just stands for state of health. And this cycler is now at the Department of Energy lab. It was originally in Stanford at the time. Had 48 channels, so you could run 48 of these cells in parallel. And for each of these cells, we gave them different charging protocols. And the goal for this early demonstration was, could we optimize a charging protocol quickly? So as fast as possible. So it doesn't take decades. Could we do it much faster than decades? But here what we're doing is we're just showing the data. And each of these charging protocols we did, we would either have 3 cells all doing the same charging protocol, 5 or 8, right? So each of those cases, we're going to repeat it because we have a lot of variability. Even exactly the same cell model, one after the assembly line, you'll get very different results. And you can see that here, right? So I've told you that every single charging protocol is at least 3 times minimum. And you don't see like lots of groups of 3 or 5 or 8, right? So even though you have cells going exactly the same charging protocol, there's big variability. Now the 3 on the left, those were battery, they were under pretty fast charging. You can see the dark blue and the 2 light blues. Those happen to be 3 that are together, but they're not really together, right? They behave very, very differently. Even under very extreme conditions, you think might narrow the variability. The variability is pretty large. But you can also see if you look at it, some of them sort of go a long ways and then kind of fall off a cliff, and some kind of go like that. So there's a lot of variation in the dynamics as you cycle batteries over and over again. You try to understand this dynamics from a cycle perspective. And so think about cycle as sort of like a discrete time index. You can see it's quite different. Some also stay very low. Some actually start at like 1.05. You haven't even cycled yet. You're already losing capacity. So that's the kind of variability. And then some batteries like last forever. You can see those way over on the right in the dark red. So that's the thing, is you're trying to optimize this very highly variable process. And if it's a new battery chemistry, they don't have the physics and chemistry worked out in detail, so you can't use mechanistic yet. Okay, after you collect more data, then you could build mechanistic models and then try to optimize the battery. So we want to take a small number of cycles. So 100 probably be, hopefully 5. I'll tell you 5 later. We'll start off with 100. And then can I just run to 100, then find out which are the good cycles, and we'll keep those, and which are the bad ones, and then that way I can converge more quickly to a good charging protocol as I keep running the cycler, maybe on the order of 3 times. Now you might think, if I want to predict how long a battery is going to last in a very long time for just the first 100 cycles, you might say, well, let's just look at the capacity at cycle 100. And so you integrate the current as you go through a discharge. That gives you a charge, a Q, and that's your capacity. And could you predict the capacity now based, could I use that capacity at 100 and predict it, let's say 1,000 or 2,000? So can I really predict the cycle life, what it will be? Cycle life shown here is the semi-log coordinate. So 1,000 cycles, of course, is 10 to the 3. And what you can see is that if you look at the discharge capacity at 100 cycles on the horizontal axis, you can't really predict cycle life very well at all. So you see a big cloud, very low correlation coefficient, not very good. Okay, so current capacity is not a good predictor of future capacity. So that's basically the point of that curve. Now you might think, well, maybe it's the change in capacity. Maybe I could take the capacity, the amount of charge at 100 cycles, minus the charge at 95 cycles, so I get kind of like a derivative. Could that predict what the cycle life is, what future capacity is, how much time it'll take to get to 80% of nominal capacity? That's terrible too, and so you can see. Now this was originally shown by Stephen Harris at the DOE lab in California, and this is more data really confirming what he also said, is you can't really just do it sort of simple-minded, looking at capacity to try to predict future capacity losses. Now, a lot of people have worked on this problem before we worked on it. So they applied fuzzy logic and neural nets and ensemble, random forest, all kinds of things, and didn't have very good results. Okay, so, and the issue was there was not the right methods. So machine learning, there's a lot of just off-the-shelf methods you can use. Deep learning, people did all kinds of papers on it, didn't have very good results. Okay, so the way we got good results was use the right kind of machine learning method. And the method we are using is referred to as sparse machine learning. And sparse machine learning is very well established and applied by, I'd say, applied machine learning people. And the way sparse machine learning works is that you end up first defining a bunch of features. In this case, a feature is just a transformation of the raw data, and you come up with a list, and then you have a selection procedure to pick the good ones. And the reason you use that approach is that if you try to use something like deep learning, it has to try to discover features and do regression at the same time. You just don't have enough quality data to do that. And so for data of the large kind of noise we're looking at, you would use a sparse machine learning. We used a very standard method known as elastic net. It was developed at Stanford some time ago, a few decades ago. And so Xi is the raw data. So that's the data you've collected that's describing what's going on in terms of the cycles. G is just some functions, so some algebraic functions of the raw data. So you get a vector G. That's called the feature vector. So it's a bunch of transformations of the raw data. You then have a linear regression coefficient W. So W transpose G is just the sum of Wi, Gi. So it's just a linear function. Yi is what you're trying to predict. In this case, we're doing the logarithm of the cycle life. You can do some statistics and some physics to show you want to use the logarithm. Turns out that works out in data. And then you just do sum of squared error. So that's just least squares. So the first term is least squares analysis. And then you add this other term, which is the penalty function term. And you want to use a combination of 1 norm and 2 norm. So 2 norm is very standard. It's called ridge regression in statistics. But if you add the 1 norm, what that will do is the 1 norm will actually drive weights to 0 that are not useful for prediction. And it'll just do it fully automatically. So it's in optimization literature, you call it an exact penalty function. So totally automated approach. You do rigorous cross-validation, it'll automatically zero out the useless ones. 2 norm won't do that, but 2 norm is very good for adding robustness to your model. In other words, getting results that aren't sensitive to data noise. And so we sat closely with battery experts, and we said, how do you think about a battery? How do you think about battery degradation? What do you plot when you want to understand battery degradation? How do you do it? And so it was actually quite an interesting exercise because this was not the way people were doing it. So most people working on it were mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, and they just would look at the data like a normal process. But actually, it's not the way battery people think about batteries. So according to battery material scientists, what they do is that they don't look at the current and they don't look at the voltage as a function of time. Instead, what they do is they integrate the current to get the discharge capacity. So Q is the integral of 0 to I, of current, I times dt. And they plot voltage versus discharge capacity. And this is really a projection of the state space for control engineers that are out there, okay? So you define the state as a capacity, which is the integral of the current, and then you have voltage, which is another state. And then they plot and think of the thing in terms of a state path, right? So in the upper left, you have the voltage of 3.5, and then as it progresses in time, you move along the state path. And that's what's shown there in the left plot. Cycle 10 is the state path from starting with charge to the end where you discharge. The voltage is much lower. And of course, you've discharged all the charge. Here, you can see it's about 1 ampere per hour. And then when you get degradation, that state path will move to the lower left like this. Okay, and so cycle 100, you can see it's moved over. And then they look at the differences between those curves as a function of voltage and charge. That's how they understand. Is it loss of lithium inventory? Is it this mechanism? That's how they try to interpret the mechanisms for degradation. If you look at the middle plot, what we're doing is we're plotting actually this vector at 110 in terms of discharge capacity, but we're plotting the difference, and that's in ampere hours. And you can see a color coding grid sort of legend over on the right. And what you'll see is it actually maps very well. So these colors are the same as we showed earlier. Yes, I don't agree with blue versus red. They choose blue to be bad and red to be good. I don't know why. That's what the original student did. And so in this case, the red ones are the ones that last forever, and the blue ones don't last very long. And it directly maps over to what we've seen before. But now we're plotting the data the way a battery material scientist thinks. Right? That's the way we're plotting it and how they interpret data. And if you actually plot the variance of that, so we defined a bunch of features. In this case, we did the variance of that change in the Q. And you can see a very high correlation coefficient, right? So you're like, okay, that's probably a good feature, right? So I haven't even done feature engineering yet. It turned out that one feature only, could predict incredibly accurately, just one feature. And that's good because we have only maybe 40 to 50 points. It's very noisy with very sort of strange noise distributions. And so you could already see here this approach really was going to work. This is actually showing it. So we've actually done just the one feature. We've also done the feature vector and then used sparse machine learning. This is actually showing the feature vector where we've done sparse machine learning. There's maybe 3 or 4 features. The main one by far is the one I just showed you. We call it the delta Q feature. And we can see that rigorous cross-validation, we're plotting a parity plot. So we have the predicted cycles to 80%, basically cycle life, and we have the observed on the x-axis. Perfect, of course, this is the 1-1 line, so you'd be along the diagonal in black. And we're using different colors to represent training and using prediction. And really, it's called testing data. So it's completely independent data, so it has no relationship to the original data. And you can see that they're very, very consistent, so we're not overfitting, which is great. You can see another one on the right where we got 7.5% error. We did a lot of variations about which batteries we include and which ones we don't include. We respected grouping, which is really important and often ignored in the community. If we take a battery and we do the same 3 charging protocols, we always group those together, move them together in any set, so you don't sort of mix those up. You want to avoid what's called information leakage. So we did that as well. And it turns out the reason these fluctuate between about 7.5 and 11 is those weird outliers, right? So which data point that lasts super long or super short will change the errors a little bit, but they're all around basically 10% error. And that's described in great detail in the paper. So that's cool, thumbs up. Now that was okay, but that was 100 cycles. It was better than what had been published before, but it wasn't like crazy better. And so what we did then is one of the points that Steve Harris made was that when you think about making a battery pack, you don't really care about predicting very accurately what the cycle life is for a cell. What you really care about is are these the good ones or the bad ones? Okay, so, and you want to make your battery pack on all the good ones. So he said, what you really care about is, can you classify really fast which ones are going to last a very long time and which ones are going to last a very short time? And then just include all the long ones in your battery pack. And then that battery pack will be very effective. And so we actually got it down in the initial work to 5 cycles. And so what we did is we replaced it as a prediction problem with a classification problem. And so could we very, very quickly in just 5 cycles tell you whether that battery state will last a very long time, short time or a long time? And by doing that, being able to classify battery, now we can compare different protocols, which is what I'll be talking about later. So this is just characterizing the state of the battery itself, not the actual protocols. So just by looking at the discharge data. So we took the cycling data, calculated our features, put it into classification. We used the logistic map, very standard approach. On the right-hand side in the upper quadrant, that's where we predicted long life and we got long life. The lower left quadrant is where we predicted short life and we got short life. And then the other 2, there's almost no points. And so we were able to classify with only 5 cycles. That's huge, right? That's a huge, huge thing because now we don't have to do 100 cycles. We can actually just do 5. So this is very short. And from then we can already make our decisions and then we can do our optimization. So to summarize what I've talked about so far, so we've been able to come now up with very early predictions. It turns out the delta Q feature was 90% of the prediction capability. We've actually done a whole bunch of things, showed it works for lots of other chemistries. The well-designed data-driven kind of modeling can make these very good predictions. We can do diverse behaviors. We can do different chemistries. I only showed one chemistry here. You have to avoid information leakage. Information leakage is where you design a protocol, but you're not very careful about when you're doing the training and the testing and you get leakage of information. So we have a whole paper in Joule that discusses this in detail. Very common mistake in literature. People will report, oh, we did it in 1 cycle. But if you look at it, it like completely leaked. So it wasn't really, like this is discharge data, for example. They'll use the charge protocol and they'll say, oh, I predict the state of the battery. Because I charge it really fast, the battery doesn't last long. But that's not predicting the state of the battery. That's predicting that if you charge really crazy fast, you destroy your battery. That's not the model here. We're trying to figure out the state of the actual battery. So second one is that, we use discharge curve. We found out you use the full curve. So don't just use scalar capacity. That doesn't work. We successfully applied it to multiple batches, both within lithium iron phosphate, which I showed here, but also for NCA and all the other battery chemistries. Those are in follow-up papers. We showed we could actually get to 3 cycles. So it's a little bit better. We had to use much more advanced machine learning. So we used a hierarchical Bayesian model. Let's describe another paper in Joule. we've applied this to lots of different chemistries and different data sets, and delta Q features always work fantastically well. Usually it's 80% of predicted value. So it turns out for lithium iron phosphate, it's about 90%. So kind of got lucky there. But it still works. Facilitate future, we've developed a lot of analysis tools. So we've also done a bunch of tools and a series of papers that are coming out that'll help give you more guidance on what properties a good feature should have. And so that's papers that are starting to come out. So now that I've done the first part, now I'm going to go to the second part, which is now we've got an early predictor. Now let's go back to our original problem. So our original problem is can we predict, can we optimize fast charging protocols? So now the early predictor is still useful, useful for battery management systems, things like that. But our main focus here was, could we use that within an optimization? So let's go back to the problem we had earlier. So we have our early predictor. We can reduce the number of cycles. So we don't have to cycle a battery to death. We can just run a relatively short number, and we can tell you whether a battery is going to be a long-lasting one or not. So that's great. But what we want to do is we want to optimize the actual charging protocols. And so I'm showing the same diagram that I was showing earlier. But in this case, what we're doing is, actually, let me put this over on that side. I'm going to show a little bit more detail. So we've got our battery cycler. We're going to do some cycling data. And so you could do anywhere from 5 to 100, let's say. And then we have this early outcome predictor. So we'll predict for a particular cell whether it will last a long time. But they'll tell us the outcome of whatever that protocol is. So if we've done a bad protocol, then that cell that we get won't be short lasting. It's a good protocol, it will be fast. I mean, it'll last a long time. Then we do a Bayesian optimization. So what that's going to do is that's going to optimize the charging protocol. And so that's an optimization problem that we solve. And then from that, we can then recommend new charging protocols on the bottom, and we send that over. And then we can modify charging protocols. We can modify battery materials. We modify processing. We can optimize whatever we're optimizing. So in this case, we're going to look just on optimization of charging protocols. We've done later work where we optimize parts of the battery. Now, one of the things when you do this kind of system is you have to think about how you're going to characterize that charging protocol. And I'll talk about that in the next few slides. But before I talk about that, I just want to tell you what the result is so that you know where we're going. So what we showed is that with this combination of the early predictor and our optimizer, we're able to go, instead of over 500 days, we could do all the entire optimization in 16 days. So that's really the bottom line. And so using this early predictor with this kind of search procedure that's more efficient than exhaustively searching, we're able to speed things up to about 2 weeks. Now, how did we do that? Well, it turns out when you're doing these kind of Bayesian optimization procedures, it's a very well-established mathematical procedure. You've heard of reinforcement learning. This is the more general concept of reinforcement learning. So you write down some model, you describe the stochasticity if you're doing more advanced kind of methods. Either way, you basically have a systematic way where you're going to do two things. You're going to explore the space, and then when you find good spots, you're going to exploit. So you're going to do more hits wherever you think the sort of the sweet spots are, the nice positions. Now, to do that, though, you have to have a way of representing what you're optimizing. So you need some kind of vector to represent it. So now, generally, Bayesian optimization procedures don't converge well if you have large degrees of freedom. And remember, we want to have the cycles maybe be three cycles. So 48 batteries, and want to converge pretty quickly. So what we did is we figured out this parameterization working very closely with our battery colleagues. So what I'm showing you over on the right is that we have a state of charge. So again, that's the amount of capacity. From 0 means that there's nothing in there. 20%, 40%, we're basically putting in current or we're adding capacity. So 20 would be 20% capacity, 40, 100% means you fill up the capacity of the battery. And then we're showing the current. So that's measured in what's called C rate, but it's basically directly proportional to the standard, amps for current. And then what we're doing is we parameterize it where we generalize the industrial standard way of charging batteries, which is called constant current, constant voltage. So instead of just doing constant current and then switching to constant voltage when the voltage gets too high, we basically do constant current for 20% called CC1, constant current CC2, constant current. And so we're just adding 20% each time. So just generalize the constant current, constant voltage. Those are our free variables. And so that's CC1 to CC3. We then constrained CC4 to be whatever it would take to reach 80% within 10 minutes. Okay, so within a certain period of time. So that's something we can just calculate just by doing integrals. And then we basically then switch over to a standard simplified protocol. So the bold line shows an example of a type of protocol. So you can see we have like 7 for the red line that's shown there for CC1, then it dropped down to between around 5, and then jumped up a little bit around 5. And so that's an example protocol. The span of like the red and the, or maybe pink/red and the blue, that's the full range that we thought was reasonable. You know, you could expect an optimal charging protocol to be between these bounds. And so that's what all of those are. So, and then our search space is to search between those. I actually have lines that are across where the exact values that we searched, you know, so you can see exactly which ones that define the protocol. Oh, sorry, yeah, 10 minutes. And again, we're using what's called dimensionless C rate, but roughly 1 C is 1.1 amperes. So it's very close to amps if you just want to think about it in terms of amps. So now the approach we use is called Bayesian optimization. It's very standard classical sort of machine learning based optimization. The technique we use is called the multi-armed bandit. So the multi-armed bandit, so the idea of the bandit is slot machines, okay? And it was called the one-armed bandit because, you know, you had one arm, you'd go like this, it steals your money. So that's the slang in the United States around Nevada. So the multi-armed bandit is basically where you have a lot of slot machines. You're trying to figure out, back when slot machines were analog, which one has a higher payout, okay? And so the idea is you go to the slot machines, you try a few samples, you try to find ones where you're hitting a little bit higher, and then you know, pump, yeah. And back when they were analog, this was actually, you could make a lot of money, okay? Because you would find there, due on just the wear and tear internally, that would actually hit higher. Now everything's digital, so now the house always wins, okay? But back then, you could actually manipulate your winnings based on which slot machine that you used. So mathematically, it's actually a stochastic scheduling problem. It's a very simple one. This particular problem completely maps over to the multi-armed bandit problem. So you have a limited amount of resources. You don't have infinite dollars to put in. In this case, it's the number of cells that we're going to do. We're going to do a bunch in parallel because the cycler has 48 in parallel. So we're going to do them in parallel. So we'll go 48 and 48. So, and the decision process we're making is actually, what is that charging protocol? Very classic reinforcement learning procedure. You explore, trying to find out where's the sweet spot, and then you exploit. And so that's really, really what the idea is. And so each of the charging protocols were actually described earlier. We had 3 degrees of freedom, but it ends up being 5 constant current steps followed by a constant voltage. I showed bold lines earlier with the protocol. What I'm showing here on the right is I'm just plotting the 3 degrees of freedom we have. So we have a CC1, CC2, and CC3. And those colors are corresponding to what will eventually tells you what CC4 is. Remember, CC4 is not free, it's something we compute. And actually, unfortunately, the way the system is it keeps showing the stuff, but that's actually what the legend is. And so you can see here, you know, what is the, you know, higher or low C rate for CC4. And so that's really defining what those constant currents are for the first 4, which are actually the key variables. And each of those dots is a unique charging protocol. And our goal is finding out what's the best protocol. So that's the way we formulate it. And so now we're actually showing each of those cycles of 48 batteries each time. So the one in the first one is those were our first tests. So we ran it through a Bayesian optimization procedure. It picks what the charging protocols will be. So it's picking choices of CC1, CC2, CC3, and then we'd implement it right on the charger. And we do 48 at once. So you can see that on the left. You can see it's sort of spread out, right? Because it's searching. It's called exploration. So it has an algorithm figuring out where it's going to search and says, okay, if you want to pick 48 points, pick these 48 points. The color is actually showing what the predicted cycle life is. So that's from our early predictor. So that's over there. So, and so you can see it's finding some dark is good. And so you can see it's finding some things that look pretty good. Then it takes that in, builds a model for the charging protocol. Okay. And so it's mapping charging protocol to cycle life. In this case, really log of cycle life. Okay. After it does that, so it's okay, what are my next 48 cycles? And that's what's shown in the second one. And you can see what is decided with that particular Bayesian optimization is that the optimum is probably pretty close to the left. You can see like a cloud, like a little bunch of points there. but it didn't do a good job sort of searching one part, so it didn't have the information there. So we don't have enough information. So you see the vertical line is showing up there over on in the second one, and so that's showing up right as this series of 6 points there, and that's just to make sure that maybe we missed something, and so the algorithm does that. Turns out it didn't, because you see there's nothing dark there. So it says, okay, that region's awful. Okay, so we're going to do more points over here, and so you can see even when you've run the cycler 3 times, it's already converged to a lot of very good protocols. And so that just happens naturally by these kind of algorithms. This is actually showing what the internal model's doing. So remember, every point is a charging protocol. When it first starts, we don't know what the answer is. And so everything is flat. And so this is the closed loop optimized, so CLO means closed loop optimization, estimated cycle life. We're not calling it control because we're doing 48 in parallel. Otherwise, you could call it control. Okay, so we're doing 48 each time we do. It's like running 48 processes at once, right? So a little different than a normal control process. We're looking at one process. We have 48 going on. And so what we have is shown there. After it does that first round of the experiments we showed on the previous slide, you can see that things have gotten more dark sort of on the left part. So that's in the second plot. And it doesn't have enough information for the rest, so it hasn't changed too much. But then as it gets to round 2, remember it collected that vertical line of more stuff. That knows that region's bad, and so you see it got lighter. So this allows you to see the internal model is figuring out like what's a good charging protocol. And you can see it just keeps getting refined. These shows the top 3 ranked that we have. And so we use a solid purple for one, a dashed for the other one, kind of a dashed off for the third one. And you can see that they're not exactly constant current, constant voltage, but they're not too far off. And so constant current, constant voltage is considered a chart as standard protocol where you're completely flat and switch over to constant voltage, which gives you kind of an exponential looking decay. This case, they were kind of close. This was actually a surprise to the battery materials people. So this was lithium iron phosphate, and they did not expect this. So they thought it would not be standard at all. But it turned out it's not too far from standard. So we've applied this to other things since then that don't give you constant current, constant voltage, or similar to that. So, but it was kind of interesting. The nice thing is the general protocol. We can apply it to any chemistry, right? We can optimize materials. We can do other things. So this is actually doing a fair comparison to the closed loop optimization, the top 3. That's in orange. As we were doing, we actually do a lot of repetitions, and so you can sort of see that quite a few points there. And you see they're kind of shifted to large cycle life. There's a lot of stochasticity still, because that's intrinsic to the battery. But you see the orange is pretty much off to the right where it should be. We did some literature inspired what the literature said should be like truly constant current, constant voltage. You see they're not quite as good. We chose some other just sort of protocols we found, and those are off to the left. So it's done a pretty good job of sort of shifting that whole stochastic solution to the right as much as we can to higher cycle numbers, right? Which is what we're trying to root for. What I show you in the right plot is we're actually doing a direct head-to-head comparison on how much optimization time per hours. So the one on the blue one at the top, that's if you use this closed loop optimization with random search without the early predictor. The next line there, which is in red, that's where we do without the early predictor, but we use Bayesian optimization, so that improves things. Better use Bayesian optimization than just a purely random search. And then you get this massive reduction with the early predictor that gives you to the bottom 2. And then the one that's to the lower is where we're doing everything basically. And so we're able to bring things down by more than an order of magnitude. I've actually done a lot of improvements on that was published in later papers. We're able to even bring that curve down so we can optimize as fast as possible the charging protocol. We don't talk about it here. We've also applied to optimize all kinds of other things, but I just don't have time to present those results. I mentioned briefly, we have optimized the Bayesian optimization algorithm. So the first one that we did was a very standard one called the LCB. Sometimes called the UCB, which is very standard. It's called the acquisition function. So it's a particular function you choose that sort of defines the exploration and the exploitation. We then compared to different acquisition functions. And we're showing you here all the mean and standard deviation. And so you can see that if you look at the colors carefully, you can see that the LCB is the really broad one. It's kind of this pukey green kind of color. And then the ones that are better, like the PI, has really brought it down. So it's brought the mean down, it's brought the variance down a lot. So, and so we've been able to make quite a few improvements, and then that was published in Applied Energy. This is actually showing, in terms of applied current density, we're plotting the objective function, and we're doing a side-by-side comparison with these different acquisition functions, which is this parameter you choose in the Bayesian optimization. And we can see that the one that we had in the original paper, LCB, basically is pretty lumpy, right where the minimum kind of is. These multiple lines is where we're actually plotting what this is all using what's called Gaussian processes, and so we're getting an estimate of the accuracy. Ones you can see, like for the EI, is more spread around than the other two, and the EI ended up performing the best for this problem. So that's the majority of my talk. Talk's pretty much over. So I just have about maybe 5 slides left to talk about how to combine mechanistic with machine learning. Now, we've done a lot in this for the last 25 years, but I'm going to focus just on one specific application that's like the coolest. And so one of the questions we asked is could we learn a lot of this mechanistic information really fast? So what happens in practice is that whenever you have a new battery chemistry, it's a pretty fussy, fiddly thing. And so it's really not, you just look it up and just run a simulation. It doesn't work that way. A lot of these chemistries are very strange, haven't really been seen before. So when you're first doing this stuff, they don't really have a good handle for what the diffusion process is inside the battery and what the kinetics are. And what makes it harder is they tend to be functions of concentration. So it's not like you just have to find a parameter. So now we've done a lot of work on video analytics over the years. And so we asked the question, could we take these well, me and my collaborators asked the question, could we use this video analytics to somehow learn the physics really fast? And so what I'm showing you up on the right is that lithium iron phosphate is actually a multi-phase system. So it has multiple stable solid phases. And you can actually do experiments where you can make a very thin electrode, and just by color, you can tell whether lithium's absorbed, and is it absorbed high, absorbed low. And it's multi-phase, which means there's multiple stable phases at the same time. And so as the evolution evolves, as lithium is either put in or out of a particular electrode, it'll change that pattern that you see. And you can just see just using a camera over the top. So, so this is showing a Cahn-Hilliard equation, which is equation for these kind of phase separating systems. And we asked, could we actually learn this information? So mu sub H is just the homogeneous part of the chemical potential. It basically defines thermodynamics. And then D is just defining diffusivity. And then we asked, could we learn it? And the answer is yes, we can learn it. So we basically parameterized these concentration dependencies using some standard parameterization that you use in machine learning. And that's actually was straightforward. We parameterized that dependency for D of C, so log of D of C, basically diffusivity, concentration dependence, as well as the homogeneous part of the chemical potential, so thermo and mass transfer. And then we showed we could converge very quickly. That's actually in the first column. We're just showing mathematically we can converge very quickly to good values. And then what I'm showing you on the right is just this picture of looking at the concentration of lithium as a function of time. So T equals 0.015, et cetera. And we just fed those images into the algorithm and then just had it search for the values for the diffusivity and the chemical potential. We showed we could actually do it first in 4, and then later we said only 2. So only 2 images is enough. So how do you do that? There's a lot of data in the image. So you get a huge amount of data, even if it's a little bit of noise in the image, to be able to actually learn these concentration dependencies. We first did it, published the algorithms, and then we published, I think it was in Nature Materials, where we actually did it for the real system. So I want to make a few comments about hybrid modeling. So this is the hottest area right now in machine learning. So if you look at all of computer science and mechanistic and mechanical engineering, all the people who are studying this sort of machine learning approaches is how do you try to combine mechanistic with machine learning? And that's huge literature, like physically informed neural nets, pins. That alone is gigantic literature. And that's like a tiny bit of it. Literature has become huge. And so people don't really know how to do that. People build these hybrid models, controls guys call them gray box models. But it's always like a one-off, it's not, or they make a bunch of assumptions. So people don't really know the best way of really bringing these together. So a lot of people are working on this. We're working on it too, and this is just one example of one way of trying to combine mechanistic modeling and machine learning together. But that's going to be the hot area now for some time in the machine learning community. we've done a whole bunch of analysis on things and a whole bunch of different procedures. The techniques we're using are basically techniques that are very much known to a subset of control people. So we'll compare data with models. We'll do what are called identifiability maps. So we'll characterize uncertainty parameters, and then we'll calculate, uncertainties. These are actually constructed by Markov chain Monte Carlo. Very standard approach to figure out the uncertainties in individual parameters. I'm showing it for the positive electrode, basically, kinetic parameter. And so we basically just using these kind of approaches that are, pretty established among a subset of the control community. This is showing examples of Markov chain Monte Carlo, where we're characterizing all the uncertainty and the parameters associated with different diffusion coefficients for the negative, positive electrode, as well as kinetic constants. And then you just plot these things. You can learn like what can you really learn from data and not, to decide, do you want to measure video, non-video, what is your resolution high enough? You can ask this in a very quantitative way, and to be able to see if you're going to get the results that you want. These show additional maps where we'll map like confidence region surfaces, basically surfaces of confidence regions. And then we'll do that to figure out like, okay, can I identify this or not identify that? And so all of this stuff you can do just using sort of standard, well, I'm going to say fairly standard nonlinear identification procedures. And we've applied this to a whole bunch of different cases where we're actually characterizing how do these effective parameters change as you change discharge capacity, cycles, et cetera. So very much looking like controls or system identification. So to summarize, hopefully I introduced you to feature engineering. So it's an approach that's effective if you have noisy data that's limited, then that's an approach that can be very effective. I then hopefully gave you an introduction to Bayesian optimization. In this case, we applied it to fast charging protocols. I then talked a little bit about hybrid modeling. In this case, we could learn concentration dependencies for thermodynamics and transport with just a small number of images. We've done the same things for learning kinetics. So the very same things described in the papers that I cited, we applied it to real batteries. And so this is a way that we could basically learn mechanistic fast. And then we're looking at, can we use that information back in to speed up the machine learning I showed earlier? And that's an area of active research. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators. So William Chu is my primary experimental collaborator. He's at Stanford Material Science. Stefano Ehrman did the original formulation of the Bayesian optimization, which I later then took over and made a lot of improvements, sort of control motivated improvements, oriented improvements. Peter was the pure material scientist on our early papers. Ajitya was the original grad student on machine learning. Martin Bizant's my main collaborator. He's in chemical engineering at MIT. Kristen, she was the one who did all the early machine learning work and all the feature engineering. Mark took over and used more of a control-oriented approach with nonlinear identifiability analysis. Hongbo did all the image work, and then Ben did some improvements on the early machine learning. And then my collaborators at Toyota, Brian and Patrick, as well as a few other people. And then funding from Toyota Research Institute and early funding from the National Science Foundation. And all these papers are all available on my website. And I'm open for questions, and yeah, hopefully we'll have plenty of time for them.
So we do have plenty of time for questions. Anybody wants to start? Here, yeah, Sylvia?
One question. Thank you, Richard, for the presentation. I had a question about the extension, actually, of potential other application within a system, let's say a small automotive system. So I was checking out that some of the application would be small scooter or golf car. So in power conversion for automotive, for example, there is a similar model of aging for the semiconductor devices. And then this model can also be used, let's say, to design the current controller and eventually how the speed controller, how the car is driven, so to maximize the lifetime.
Yeah.
And then it's clear about the thermal cycling, like try to reduce the amplitude of thermal cycling.
Yeah.
Could this be foreseeable in this case? So using, like I see you design the charging and discharging model as a control aspect, as an operating aspect. Yeah. Would it be foreseeable and to do, let's say, upper level control within a context of a small scooter? Some kind of,
we've thought a lot about all that. So I've only talked about like a little bit of our research here. Okay. So we have a whole other thing about designing the advanced battery management system, incorporative early predictors and controls, and how do you do the control, and how do you do the controls fast? How do you update what are the appropriate models? this kind of information kind of like feeds into that, right? So when you look at the controls, basically you can do a lot of well, I'll give you a flavor for some of the ideas, right? So if you look at a series of papers by my group and a few other groups, we've been using very hardcore mechanistic modeling and putting that into the ABMs, Advanced Battery Management Systems. A lot of papers on that, okay? So, but we've been looking at lots of approaches to make these solutions crazy fast, right? Like unbelievably fast. And so we use techniques like Julia, you know what I'm talking about? So we use various and lots of numerical algorithms tricks to make things very fast. And then you can do basically reduced order models if you'd like to basically make it even faster, because you want to put the energy into the scooter and moving it, not into the computer to calculate what you want for the scooter. Same way with automotive vehicles. So there's a lot of activity in that area. These are really predictors you can use to help inform that kind of information. But what you can also do is even when you actually take the battery pack out, you can use this to figure out which of the cells should you keep, okay? And which one should go to second use applications, such as using it for storage for wind power and other applications. So we talk about a lot of those ideas in the early papers in Nature and Nature Energy. So we actually give a pretty big view of it there. And then follow-on papers where we're working on all this other stuff. So yeah, and not just me. I mean, there's big groups in England. There's there's lots of big groups. This is a huge field now, right? So and so a lot of people are using these to sort of help inform these other procedures that they're doing. So yeah, no, good questions.
Thank you. Some other questions here in the room? Yeah? Andy?
Thank you very much. This was very inspiring talk. So I'm wondering if you say you start with 5 cycles for prediction, right? Mm-hmm. So if later on the battery pack is in a completely different environment, that mm-hmm. means, for example, completely other temperature, environmental mm-hmm. conditions, how does this affect your prediction?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So so in the early battery technology, including with Tesla, they made some mistakes that were pretty public. And so there's I think Car and Driver magazine where they were going to test out, I think it was a Tesla if I remember correctly, but it was one of the electric vehicles, and they were going from New York City driving to Boston, but it happened to be during the winter. And it turned out that the car completely died in less than an hour. They were stuck on some, road with like all the snow. It was like really awful. Wasn't the best, Car and Driver advertising for the car companies. But what they figured out pretty quickly is that you have to have very good temperature controls, and so a modern automotive vehicle has very, very good temperature controls. The sensitivity to temperature is very, very high. We purposely designed control. We used temperature control cyclers in our system, but they weren't perfect. We didn't buy the highest end cycler because you have limited money. Mm-hmm. And so it would vary by maybe plus or minus 1 degree. You can see it, plus or minus 1 degree. You can see the effects just from that. Mm-hmm. And it's also important because, before they were doing this work, the main standard was to do what's called accelerated testing. And so accelerated testing is you would raise the whole thing up, 10 degrees or so. But the problem is that the activation energies from the different things are so different that what you're getting is not representative, right? So, yeah, this was a big mess. Okay, so, but now if you look today, you can see groups out of, Texas A&M and others where even academic groups do very detailed thermal modeling to make sure that when they actually design the system, you can run in Alaska, you can run in San Diego, California, because otherwise, yeah, it's a disaster. It doesn't take very much degrees to mess everything up. So, yeah.
We have 2 questions online. One from Braatz Sutar. I have a question. In the Bayesian estimation, when the 48 cells were first given one set of charging profile to charge, how long the cells were running to figure out the good charging profiles from bad charging profiles. He means to ask, were you using 100 cycles for testing for every iteration in the Bayesian estimation?
Yeah, so what we did to be able to know the answers, we had to have some measure of ground truth a priori, right? So we have to be able to validate our approaches. And so the way we validated the early predictor was that we just ran a whole bunch of different charging protocols. And then to get a handle on variability, we did a lot of triplicate, like groups of 3, 5, and 8, basically. And I'm only showing some of the data here. So we have other groups of data, which are with the paper. So in that case, what we're doing is we're doing all of that to be able to test cells of very different conditions, right? So that's the purpose. And then to have a measure of variability as well. When we actually train the predictor, though, we're only training on discharge data, not on charge data. That's very important. If you charge on charge data, which a lot of people have fallen into this mistake, then you're basically getting a mapping between charging protocol and prediction, which is not what you're trying to do here. What you're trying to do here is be able to say, just on discharging the battery, can I tell the state, the state of the system? So this was purely for early prediction. So in this case, we collect all the data, which means we ran almost all the cells out, which you can see in exactly this plot. Now we ran it out to like up to thousands, right? So with the blue one, we only ran to 150 or so because we would just run to 85% to nominal, then we'd stop. Okay, there's no point at that point to keep doing it. And then we just kept doing it. The ones that lasted a very long time, the question was how many cycles. We ran it past 1,000, but at some point we just get, we're like, these last forever, so it doesn't matter anymore, So we basically did a huge number. And then after we have all that huge number, then we said, okay, if we really knew what we were doing, how efficiently could we do it? And because we converged to a feature, delta Q, that's very generalizable, because we tested on other chemistries, then we actually have something that we can generalize and use to lots of things without having to do all of this again, right? So you don't need to do this anymore. We've already done thorough validation. Does that answer the question satisfactorily? Or?
Barrett, is it okay? Yes, he's happy.
Okay. Okay.
Then we had another question from Taranjit Singh, which is about the temperature. So I assume you kind of answered, but let me repeat the question. He's pre-assuming one of the features is temperature of the battery cell. We are talking about the battery pack where there are not a lot of temperature sensors and possibly have to look into estimation techniques. I'm imagining that the actual temperature difference between the cells would affect the prediction quite a lot. And for example, the temperature is quite low and the estimation is wrong, it could lead to deplatting and eventually dendrites and short circuits or so eventually make the pack bad.
Yeah.
How do you take that into account?
Yeah, so that was the problem in the original one with car and driver and all of that, that they didn't do it. But now they have incredibly detailed temperature maps. And what they do is they do the design of the system so that with the cooling system that's set up, they get very high uniformity. And that testing is very thorough now. They do full thermal maps, they do all the thermocouples, not on the one on the road, but they're doing that in the testing site at Toyota, right? So they've already done all of that there, tested it out, do it all kinds of conditions. They do a lot of testing both in the computer and experimentally to make sure that the combination of design and their control systems with a limited number of thermocouples is going to work. But they do all the other thermocouples and compare that to models to make sure in the lab that their models are very good and they've got a good design. And they figure out what is the minimum that they need actually, out there on the field. And then that's the ones that they do. But it's very mechanistic and very well developed. There's actually a lot of papers on the last 5 years. So you can read in great detail what they do. Full finite element model. I mean, it's very impressive what's been doing. And a lot of academics were funded to do it. So it's like all the details are out there, software is out there. So, but it was a high motivation because they had these problems with the early ones where, they didn't, obviously when the company, they didn't expect car driver 1 hour and then they say this sucks, right? So there was a learning, and then they really hit that one very thoroughly. So, but you're right, they build state estimators. All this stuff is stuff that's you can read detailed literature on that topic. So, yeah.
Maybe some more questions in the room. I have some more in the chat, so we can continue. Thank you for your interesting presentation, says Leon Berger. His question is if similar machine learning-based approaches have been considered, but using DFN models instead. I don't know what DFN models are, but
tell us what DFN models are. So,
all right, I'll move to another question then. From Hung Yong Che. This is, I want to ask, what is your opinion regarding using synthetic data to enhance training of machine learning models?
I have a whole paper on that. So, that's a really good question. So, so I think that at a minimum, I think that, well, the problem is we couldn't use that for this particular thing because there are so many different degradation mechanisms, and there is no model that really describes all those mechanisms, and you don't know which ones are really dominant for a new cell, basically. So we couldn't do it for that case. But if you have cases that start to get more and more developed, I mean, lithium iron phosphate is getting more developed, and it looked like it was going off the market, but now it won't go on, won't go off the market. So if you get enough information where you could actually build all of that, then you could do really good ground truth, right? Like really good. Our ground truth here is kind of like, well, kind of, because we don't have a detailed mechanistic model, right? So we're just doing our kind of, in quotes, ground truth. It's based on all the data by running all these different cycles, right? So, but if you have really good mechanistic models and stuff in training, I think that would be great. We published a paper last year where we actually did a whole bunch of synthetic data, but it was asking different kinds of questions. We've actually published a couple different papers on that, where we were basically looking at, could we figure out like what is the appropriate circuit, like other questions, right? So, so there are cases where it can be useful. But I think whenever you have a new battery chemistry, the problem is there's about 16 mechanisms. You have no idea which ones are dominant. And you don't have the data measured inside to be able to figure out what's going on that well. The problem with these batteries, it's important to understand, is that most sensors you put in the battery destroys the battery. Right? Because you've got anything that's electrical, and now it'll start get your sensor, it'll just start getting eaten up by this chemistry or that chemistry or deposit. And so you're always limited by what you can really measure. Now, I work well with Martin Bazant. We are looking at trying to come up with lots of novel ways, like listening. So we spend a lot of time listening to the batteries now. And it's very cool. You can actually hear individual particles crack when you get cracking in the battery. It's pretty cool. And what's cool also is there's a lot of literature, not on batteries, but on earthquakes, in California and elsewhere. And it's basically, we're using more or less the same technology that they use for listening to the ground. We're just, listening to batteries, And so we have this whole effort on acoustics to try to put acoustic sensors everywhere and then listen and then feed that into our workflow, So that's because again, that one we can do without sticking it in the battery and destroying the operation of our battery, right? So that's the tough thing about using synthetic on the degradation part. So we'd be using it for the non-degradation part, basically, so we don't have these issues. You follow? So yeah, well, it's a good question.
Oh, question here.
Did I get it correctly? This whole analysis was done for a specific chemistry of the battery.
Well, for this particular one was LFP. We have a whole series of other chemistries. Not only did on our lab, but while we were doing it, other sets came on market. We also have papers where we analyze all, data from other groups. So we've analyzed a lot of data, to be honest. I showed this one because this was the first one where I really demonstrated the feature engineering approach. So.
Do you have then any ideas how you could combine these models that you have, the two models, with some, I don't know, form of latent space regarding the chemistry to really combine the insights for this A123 cell with some other cell which has a different chemistry, for example, or the different form of not lithium-ion or metal oxide battery stuff? Yeah,
so far we've kept within lithium-ion so far. We've applied the delta Q to lots of different data sets and lots of batteries, and the delta Q has always worked well. We have a physical interpretation for it too. So when we did it for LFP, we suspected it was generalizable because it's not the capacity, but it's basically similar to the energy, okay? But you're basically weighting certain voltage ranges differently, basically. So it's almost like you're weighting some of the electrons a little bit more, like as though they have higher voltage. So we've done thorough detailed analysis on all kinds of chemistries, and we've actually taken that and figured for delta Q, this is how detailed it is, okay? The delta Q feature has a certain weighting it chooses, so you can think about it as being like normal energy, so voltage times charge, basically, BQ. But basically what we do is you have a little bit more weighting in a certain range, okay? So that's what we do. So we've now compared that to lots of different chemistries, but we also asked the question, what if we did optimization where we optimize the weights because we have enough cells? And what we find is that if you do a huge bunch of math, you can basically get slightly better, but then you get a feature that's not generalizable. Mm-hmm. So it turns out the delta Q weighting happens to be one that's over a voltage range that's very generalizable, basically. It's not necessarily optimal for any specific one, but in the early stage, you don't have enough chemistry, enough cells to figure out what's optimal, right? We can only do it after that because we have lots of data sets now that have lots of cells, right? Mm-hmm. So now we have done a lot of things with latent variables, and there's a lot of papers on it where you basically apply partial least squares and things like that. We've actually found that that we've done a lot of analysis where we say, well, what if we did a PLS where we use like one latent variable? Okay, because then you don't need as many cells to get like one. So you basically, for everyone else, you're projecting all the data down to basically an optimal vector, and then you test. Let's just simplify it. Okay, so we basically did that, and we thought that was promising. But then what we found, which was just published a few months ago, that we did vastly better if we just used fused lasso. So let's talk about that. Lasso is an leather elastic net kind of approach, but what it does is that so elastic net is what I was showing, by the way. So you do a weighted 2 norm and 1 norm, and you're basically just using more or less least squares with some other penalties. Okay, lasso is usually a bad method, but lasso just has the 1, so you don't have the robustness, and it's actually an awful method, by the way. But there's variations on lasso. One's called fused lasso. So what it does is it basically, when the setting is coefficients, if coefficients are close, there's basically a penalty so that if they can stay close, they stay close. And so they get fused in some sense. That's amazing for this application. And so if you do it for this application, what it will do is it'll actually give you weightings and stuff that aren't so different from the delta Q feature, actually. So it's pretty good. We've actually compared that also to the physics of the battery by using some more detailed analysis. And it seems to be, it's a very good approach where if you try to do latent variable methods, it's just purely data driven. So you think, but if you use lasso, we've actually found that the vectors that you get are much more consistent with mechanistic, what the optimal vector would be. Okay, that's what's really cool. So we have a detailed paper that analyzes this, discusses in great detail. So we're very, very pleased with that kind of approach. It's related to another branch of literature that's where your goal is to find an optimal function. And so there's a functional analysis kind of perspective on it. So you don't think about it as a vector. You say, here's a function of X, let's find the function. And so there's a whole bunch of like niche literature on this. And it turns out they talk about related things there, about finding the functions. And so the reason why all this ends up being, it may be found very esoteric mathematically, but generally when you actually do the math with any kind of vector, what you find out is any regression vector is not unique. Okay. And so what happens if you can take any regression vector, and if you add a vector in the null space of the data, you'll get the same input output because the vector you've added to the null space of the data doesn't affect the output. Okay. So use the fused lasso. What it's doing is actually picking a vector, which is also very mechanistically consistent, right, of all of that family, right? So, and so we published that maybe 3 months ago. So you can read about that. So we're very happy with that. So now fused lasso is like a go-to. It's much better than PLS, principal component regress, like all the other latent variable methods. It does much better than elastic net. It does. It's like fused lasso is very. Wasn't our idea, right? We didn't make it up, but we we looked through, and that's what we found. We looked at this functional analysis related literature. So yeah, we're big fans of that. That's one of our feature analysis techniques now. Is that to give us guidance about what should the feature look like? You follow? Yeah. No, it's very cool question. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. So we have the explanation of DFN. It's Doyle, Fuller, Newman physics.
Oh, the standard Newman model. Okay, so ask the question now that I know it's the Newman model. Okay.
So did you try or to compare with?
Newman-like model. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. So yeah. So the original grad student who worked on it, first thing he did was the Newman model. So there's a standard model. People usually call it the Newman model, the Newman-Doyle model. I hadn't heard it called the DFN model, but okay. People have different names. People also call it the P2D model, pseudo 2D model. That says they also call it that. There's another one. They also call it pore selector theory model. So there's a lot of names for the same thing. Okay. It's like the standard battery model. Okay. Very heavily used. It turns out that my first grad student applied that model to this. It was actually a disaster. Okay. So why is it? This is actually a multi-phase battery. The Newman model only works for single phase. Okay. So then what we did is we then applied the correct model for this battery, which is called multi-phase porous electrode theory. And so it actually accounts for the fact that you have multiple stable phases. Okay, so that was all applied, and it's in a thesis that was published last year by Mark Rowland. It's downloadable for free. So we have done all of that before. So we have done it. It took a long time though, because the model is very computationally expensive, much more expensive than Newman model. It's about 100 times more expensive than Newman model. So it took, we ran it on supercomputers and stuff to be able to do it. So this other stuff I showed here, you could do on a tablet, So pretty much simpler, right? But we could do this after the fact because then we had all the then we had a lot more data, right? Then we could actually train, advanced versions of Newman model or modifications of Newman model.
Well, thank you, Richard. We have another question from the room. If not, let's thank Richard again. So the talk was recorded. If the quality is not too bad, posted, and if Richard agrees, of course, posted on YouTube, on the YouTube channel of IFAC. And so you'll have the opportunity to have this. This answers some questions where people wanted to have slides. So they might find it on YouTube later on. And we have many people on the chat saying, thank you, Richard. Great talk. So thanks again.